Hi, in today's video, I'm going to show you how I turn this area in my shed into this area. I'll do a step-by-step guide on how I come up with the idea and then also how I then built the whole project. So the first thing to do was measure the space that I wanted the unit to sit in. And then once I had the space measured for how big I wanted the unit to be, I needed to come up with a little concept design, which I've shown you above. It's very rough and very basic sketch, but it was essentially just to get the unit measurements and the measurements for the pieces of wood that I would need. Not only did I want to use the unit for storage, but I also wanted it to somewhere to hang my drills and a couple of other power tools that I've got. But that would be done as I go. There's no point drawing that out, or I didn't think there was any point drawing that out really. So first of all, I removed all the tools and all the bits and pieces that were sitting on the current shelf I had, and then removed the shelf off the wall. I made that shelf quite a long time ago when I had a few spare bits of wood. As you can see, it's a bit of a mismatch of wood, some MDF, some plywood, some treated timbers there, and I just screwed them all together just to give me a bit of space and some area to put my tools on. What you can see here is they're getting all the raw plugs out of the hole, so I used some very thin nose pliers and then had to drill them out of a HSS bit. What I brought from the local merchants was a whole sheet of plywood, and I asked them to cut into 2 metre lengths off of the 2.4 piece, which was really useful because it will end up giving me the exact size I need for the whole shelf. And then I just cut 3 sections out of that. So what I ended up here with was 3 1 metre sections by 300, which is the depth I wanted for the shelving unit. What happened here was I had a slight change of plan. So instead of all of my shelves being a depth of 300 mil, I decided to change them. So the bottom depth was 300, then the middle was 250, and the top one was 200 mil. So it would be easier to reach to the back of the shelf. I didn't need the top shelf to be very deep because there isn't very much room between the top of the unit and the ceiling. And also I'm running it in parallel with the unit side by side, so I can store long, thin trim pieces of wood or really thin, long lengths of wood on top of both of the cabinets to stop them from bowing and keep them off the floor. Quick blast with the blower. What I needed to do now was create the little notches where the tools would be hanging in the unit. So I got the bottom piece of wood, I marked out the centre, and then I measured each side. So I wanted 5 tool holders to be on the bottom piece of wood. I had pre-measured the thickest width of the tools that I wanted to hang in the thing, and they were all comfortably under 10 centimetres. The majority of them were about 8 centimetres at the thickest point. So I used 10 centimetres either side of the centre mark, but for the first one I had to mark 5 centimetres either side, so the middle one would be central to the whole piece of wood, and then measured 10 from there twice on each side. I've included a little sketch diagram just in the corner of the screen just to demonstrate what I mean, because my camera work isn't that great and I wasn't that close to what I was actually doing, but hopefully it makes sense from the diagram. Once I had the slot for each of the tools measured out at the 10 centimetre distance, I needed to measure the thinnest width of each of the tools so that I could easily slot them in and they could hang either upside down or with one of the tools the right way up. Then, leaving an equal gap either side within the 10 centimetre gap, I measured the centre point and measured each way out from there. So each tool would hang central to the 10 centimetre gap, but would be thin enough so it could slot in quite easily. Again, there's a little diagram in the corner just to demonstrate what I mean. Then I spent a little bit of time lining them all up, making sure they were all nice, and I then marked the point where I wanted the hanger to stop. So I used the handles on most tools, and then I marked out how far I wanted each of the hanging pieces to go back. Using a combination square, I drew up to the mark that I wanted the hanger to finish, and then used a can of WD-40 because it's a nice round edge to make a half moon shape at the top. After clamping the piece of ply to my workbench, I then cut out each of the marks that I'd made, and checked each time with the tool that was going to be housed in that little bit, just to make sure it fit nice and it was quite snug, and also it hung correctly. As you can see, there was a little bit of fine tuning on a couple of the tools just to make sure it fit nice. Gave the whole thing a going over with the orbital sander. I think I was using 120 grit paper just to give a nice smooth finish and get rid of any rough edges. What you can see happened here is the top layer of plywood flew off when I was sanding it. So what I've done was got the trusty mitre fast out of the shed and then stuck it back down, and it was, you couldn't tell the difference once it was stuck back on. Another blast with a leaf blower to get rid of all the dust. Used the router to make the edges smoother and a rounded edge, just so there's not a lot of wear and tear and bangs and bashes on it. And then gave the whole thing a going over with a sander again, just to remove any rough bits. Next up was measuring and cutting the two end pieces. I went for 400mm here for the height of my cabinet, just to fit in the space nicely. So I measured 400mm from each end of the piece of wood. Then clamping it to the bench and then cut the two pieces off with the track saw. I have my vacuum attached there just for a bit more dust extraction, because it does kick up a lot of dust. And in the future videos, what you'll probably see is I've made a dust extraction system, which I looked at Charlie DIY and the Badger Workshop just to get the idea, and it's been really useful on future projects that you may see coming up. As I mentioned earlier, there was a slight change of plan midway through, and the bottom shelf was 300mm, the top shelf was 200mm, and originally it was going to be the bottom two shelves with 300mm, but I changed the middle shelf to 250mm, which is what I'm just doing here, currently just trimming a slight bit off the edge of it. Because of my slight change of plan, I now had to make the two end pieces angled, so they started at 400mm at the bottom and ended at 200mm at the top. So I clamped them both together, adjusted the depth on my plunge saw to about 40mm just to cover a little bit more, and then sliced off the edge that I'd marked up. Then I had to stick the end pieces onto the base. I used a little trick here that I saw in another DIY woodworking video, but unfortunately I can't remember which one, but used normal wood glue along with mitre fast. So put a little bit of wood glue on in different parts of the wood, and then use the mitre fast in between that to create a really quick stick. And then also with the wood glue have a longer term, stronger bond between the two pieces of wood. Also, I drilled pilot holes and then used 1.5" screws just in the wood to again keep it really tight. And I used my measuring square just to ensure that a right angle was correct. Wiped off any excess glue and then just flipped it over and repeated the same process on the other side. Now attaching the top piece, I flipped it over, used some wood glue, again pilot holes and 1.5" screws. Didn't need the mitre fast this time. To check it was square, I measured from corner to corner just to ensure they were both the same size. It sometimes needs a little bit of adjustment, but it seemed okay. Getting the middle shelf in is quite tricky, but I measured halfway down on both the front and the back, made a little mark, the plywood, which is quite easy to tell as there's a number of sheets and you just pick the middle one. Then drilled a pile of holes, and again using the same screws, screwed it in tight. Apologies for the filming here, it's a bit rubbish, and most of what I've done is out of the camera shot, but I think you get the idea. Using the palm router, I went over all of the corners and edges just to get it all nice and smooth, make them well rounded, and again, hopefully save on bashes and wear and tear a little bit. There's the whole unit are going over with the orbital sander and use a 120 grit paper just so it's got a really nice smooth touch to the finish. Now I needed to attach some brackets to mount it to the wall, so I removed the middle shelf, used some cheap brackets from B&Q, measured out 5 different spaces and attached the brackets using some very small screws that are just shy, I think they're 15 mil, so they're just a bit smaller than the thickness of the plywood, so I can drill them in. Inside the shed and using my laser level, I line the laser up with the bottom screw on the cabinet that is next to this new cabinet. So the laser line runs level all the way around the shed, and I can line up the bottom screw holes of the new cabinet in line with the old one so the tops would match, and then use my little pen just to mark the wall. Then taking one bracket, mark the top holes of all the holes that I'd already marked. Using a Sharpie, I marked on the SDS drill bit the depth of the raw plug, so I knew how far I needed to go into the wall, and then using all the marks I'd made on the wall and the SDS drill, drilled a hole for all of the raw plugs to sit in, and put raw plugs in all the holes. Then held the cabinet up to the holes and screwed in one at each end because there's not much weight on the cabinet at the moment, although the cabinet does weigh a fair bit, so it could easily be held up by one screw at each end, and then proceeded to drill all of the remaining holes. I had a spirit level on the top of the cabinet just to ensure it was level, and I could adjust it as I was going on. Here's a little close-up of all the screwed brackets and the spirit level to show it is level. I had measured a bracket for the middle shelf just to give it a bit of support in the middle, but didn't need all of them along the whole way like the top shelf did. But what you might be able to see is just below my hand is a mistake that I made where I held the bracket against the wall, drilled 2 holes for the bracket to sit in, but it was actually at the wrong height, so I had to then re-drill them. That's a slight mistake. There's mistakes that everyone makes, and I made them. Then I drilled the holes into the brick and then tightened up the bracket to the wall and to the unit again, just to give it that extra support in the middle, as I said. It doesn't look straight, but it is. I think I must have had the camera at a funny angle, because if you check the spirit level bubble, it should look good. Marked out 3 measurements for the brackets to go on the very bottom shelf, again as extra support to give it a bit more support when all of the weight is on the cabinet, and then repeated the process as I've done with the top and the middle shelf. What you probably notice is the middle one on the bottom shelf doesn't quite match up with the middle and the top one, which was really annoying, and I didn't notice this until quite a lot later. Because it's in my shed and it's the bottom one, which is pretty much hidden from view when standing up, I never bothered to fix it, but it was quite annoying. Using the 15mm screws, I just attached the brackets to the unit. Now it's just a case of putting all the tools in the hanger and all the tools on the shelves just to fill it up. A few things I did know from before doing this is the brickwork in my shed. It was built in around the 1950s, so the brickwork isn't that great. There is quite a lot of holes in it where I've had various different shelves and various different hangers and hooks, so at some point I need to go around filling all them holes and then repaint a lot of the areas in the shed where the holes are, but for now it's okay, and I was just going to leave it until I get round to doing the whole shed in one go. Thank you for watching, and please, I'd really appreciate it if you liked this video, if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe and add any comments that you've got, which I'll happy to answer. Thank you very much for watching.